Okay, you're good to go.
Thank you, Kathy. Welcome, everybody. I'm Ed Merrick, serving as your district governor this year, and want to welcome you all to another Friday feature today. And very excited about this one. I had the opportunity to speak with our speaker last week, and we had a rather lengthy conversation. But to introduce her, I will turn it over to Craig Leiser, past district governor. Craig?
Thank you, Ed. Well, I met Raina's father before I met Raina. Raina's father was a Rotary pre-ambassadorial scholar, but an exchange student on behalf of Rotary to Belgium back in the early 1980s. And Raina's father is a professor at Hamline University. And I was trying to get some information from him about exchange students, where they'd gone, what they'd done, and how they'd build a career based on their experiences. And at the end of this discussion, he said, well, I've got a daughter who's out in Boston right now, and I think she'd be interested. Let me contact her, and I'll have her contact you. You know, the typical Rotary, I know somebody who knows somebody, and therefore we get it all done type of program. So one thing led to another, and I contacted, or Raina contacted me by email. We talked a little bit, and we said, you know, we need a sponsoring club if you want to be a Peace Fellow. So the Stillwater Sunrise Rotary Club agreed to sponsor Raina the first time. And she was sponsored, she was submitted, she was not selected. So a year goes by and Raina's still working at things out in the Boston area. And I'm starting to work now with Chris Weber from the Northfield Rotary Club. And we're trying to select the most qualified candidate that we could put forward as a Peace Fellow from our District 5960. My club, Stillwater Sunrise, once again agreed to, quote, sponsor Raina. And this time, Raina was selected by our district, submitted to Rotary Foundation, and selected by them as one of the Peace Fellows. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately after respect, she was selected to go to the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. I had been there, and I had just had a chance to meet with a gentleman who was in the Rotary Club in Brisbane. And I said, I think we're going to be sending you a very talented young lady one of these days. And so then I thought that was a good deal. So Raina met with Chris Weber and myself at the south end of Minneapolis. She brought the goodies. We brought the coffee. And so we discussed a whole variety of things. And she said, I'm not really interested so much in going to Brisbane, Australia. I wanted to go to, you know, fill in the blank, Wales, Scandinavia, one of the other locations. And I said, Raina, the good news is you got selected as a Peace Fellow. The less than good news perhaps for you right now is that you're going to Brisbane. But the better news is Brisbane's a heck of a place to go. Australia is a beautiful country. Rotary is very well established. You'll make many friends. And who knows how it will lead you and your path going forward. So Raina was selected. A little bit perhaps grudgingly initially, off she went to Australia. And at that point, I will turn it over to Raina to tell us what transpired on her arrival in Australia. So Raina, it's yours.
Thank you so much, Craig. That was a really lovely narrative that set me up to seem very ungrateful. And I think I should clarify that I was really honored to receive the Peace Fellowship. And as you perhaps know, there are 5 different peace centers around the world. And the reason that I had been hesitating about Queensland was because I had learned that one of the other programs had a more specific focus that was connected to my interests. But in the end, I'm so grateful that I was at Queensland. But I will not get into that part right now. So first of all, it's really great to meet you all. I've met some of you, I think, because I've spoken to the Stillwater Sunrise Club. I also sent a video in the fall for the district meeting, so some of you may have seen my face before. But I'm really honored that you invited me to come speak about positive peace, because this is an area that I have always been very passionate about, but didn't know it until semi-recently because I had never heard of this framework. So if it's okay, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to see if that's possible. I should have probably tested that first. Yes, I think it is. And I am going to present my own slides. Oops. You present. So do you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay,
They're-
great.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank
It's
you
on.
so much. Great. So wonderful. So as Craig said, my name is Raina Fox. I was a Rotary Peace Fellow from 2018 to 2019 at University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. And I am from Minnesota. I'm from Mendota Heights. And have been living in Boston, yes, for the last few years. I will tell you a little bit about my background and what led me to decide to become a Rotary Peace Fellow and how that connects to positive peace. So what I'm thinking is that for the next half hour, I'll talk a little bit about my journey as a Peace Fellow. So what led me to do that program? What did I actually do as a Rotary Peace Fellow? And then how did that lead me towards becoming a Positive Peace Ambassador with Institute for Economics and Peace? And what is that positive peace framework? And then I'm hoping that we'll have some time to actually talk about how that might be relevant to all of you. So for some context, the Institute for Economics and Peace is a think tank based in Sydney, Australia, that I actually got to go visit. And they have partnered with Rotary International and the Rotary Foundation to select a group of people to be positive peace activators to work with Rotary clubs to try to use this framework in ways that are actually supportive of the efforts that you're already undergoing. But it's an experiment. I should start from the outset saying I'm not an expert. I'm also not paid for this. It's something I'm doing because I'm interested. So it's a volunteer role. So when we get to it, I'll answer my questions or your questions as much as I can, but I'm also learning. So just to get started, this is Jane Addams. I don't know if any of you have heard of Jane Addams. She was a 19th century reformer. She was based in Chicago and started the settlement house movement. And she's just somebody that I really admire and have admired for a really long time. And this is a quote of hers that I have always held very close to my heart. And this quote is, "True peace is not merely the absence of war, it is the presence of justice." So long before I heard about positive peace, this is something that I had already been thinking about when I was driven in my work, in my social change work. But when we ask what is positive peace, it turns out that it actually looks a lot like this quote from Jane Addams. So what is positive peace? So positive peace, actually, in order to answer it, it's probably easier to start with negative peace. So there's this concept that Johan Galtung, who's a Swedish thinker who's still alive, he designed this concept in the 1960s of negative peace and positive peace. So often when we think about peace, we think about it in relation to conflict or violence. But it's not always that clear cut. So negative peace is the absence of violence or fear of violence. But positive peace is the attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. So basically, it's not enough to just know that you will be able to walk through the street without being shot. You also need to feel that you are able to live and thrive in your life. And so a thread in my work has been, how do we build the systems of justice that make it possible for everyone to thrive? So the Institute for Economics and Peace have really made this their focus. So every year for the last 14 years, they've been doing studies that measure both negative peace and positive peace. And later we'll get into the details of that, but just to set it up, the way that they measure positive peace is looking at these different indicators. So they look at whether there's a well-functioning government, equitable distribution of resources, free flow of information, good relations with neighbors, high levels of human capital, acceptance of the rights of others, low levels of corruption, and a sound business environment. So for me, it's helpful that they have actually mapped out these different areas, because it's one thing to say we want positive peace, as in the presence of justice. It's something else to actually pull that apart into pieces that we can measure. So that is what Institute for Economics and Peace does. They measure two different systems, the negative piece of the absence of violence, and also positive piece, the presence of these different factors. So I offer this just as a contour once I start getting into who I am. So yeah, so Craig already gave a little bit of background on my Peace Fellowship journey. So I've been connected to this process since 2015. So I'm going on 5 years now of being in the loop of Rotary Peace Fellowships, if I consider that I first applied back in 2015. So a little bit about my background is that I've worked in a range of different social change organizations for about 13 years now, in Minnesota, in India, in Washington, D.C., in Rhode Island, and in Boston. And my work has spanned a variety of different issues, but they kind of fall into 3 categories. One is arts for social change. So using things like playwriting to support language and grammar skills in youth and help young people navigate trauma. Or when I was living in rural India, working at a grassroots organization that supported traditional craftspeople in livelihood building. So that's one area of focus. Another is memory and dialogue. So I've always been interested in how we remember difficult histories. And some of this comes from my own personal family experience of being raised in an Ashkenazi Eastern European Jewish family, where we were affected by the impacts of the Nazi Holocaust. And so thinking about how those memories have influenced my family and my commitment to social justice, but also the complexities of how traumatic histories then unfold sometimes into reproducing violence. And so that's something that has always been of interest to me. I've worked on an oral history project around Guantanamo Bay. I've worked in museums. I did a research paper in my first master's. So this is before I did the Peace Fellowship. I did a master's at Brown University in Public Humanities, where I was interested in how museums remember difficult histories. But sort of by the end of that master's, I was already starting to question, not just wanting to remember our mistakes, but how do we translate that into building more positive systems of peace? So after that master's, I worked for a while in more organizing for social justice and sustainable development goals. Specifically, I was working at a network called Millennium Campus Network, where we worked with undergrads in over 50 countries who are working on the Sustainable Development Goals. And I worked with the United Nations, organized conferences for youth who are working on the Sustainable Development Goals. So anyhow, this is perhaps too much background, but this is all stuff I had done before I even got to the point of wanting to apply for the Rotary Peace Fellowship. And why that? So basically, I come to the point where I was noticing 3 patterns. One is that I was noticing that conflict is linked with every other social justice issue and development issue. So understanding it is critical. Another thing I had noticed is that conflict is inevitable, but violence isn't. And conflict also is not always a bad thing. Sometimes conflict leads to important social change. I would argue, for example, that the tensions that we're feeling right now in the country in the wake of George Floyd's death are actually really important and healthy for our country to be navigating, because we want to be a more racially just society. So I was interested, even before I did the fellowship, in how can conflict be transformative and distinct from violence. And the third was, we need to move away from traditional models of conflict towards sustaining positive peace. And this is really getting to, there's a long history at the international sphere of aid and development and peace building that actually end up reproducing dynamics of people in what we call the global north, which is especially Europe and the United States and Canada, being in positions of power when really it should be people who are at the heart of whatever the development context is who are leading. So these were things that I was interested in. So I applied for the Rotary Peace Fellowship, and I was really, really honored that I was selected the second time around. As you perhaps know, there are 5 centers around the world. There's one in Sweden, one in England, one in Japan, one here in the US at Duke and UNC at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And then there's one in Australia, the University of Queensland, and that is the one that I was selected to join. So the components of the Peace Fellowship are that you do a master's in peace and conflict, you have an applied field experience, you commit to speaking and representing Rotary, and you have to commit to both having had experiences in peace building and continuing to contribute to peace building. And one thing that's really special about it is that there's a global network of hundreds of people who have done this program. And I must say that in the wake of the fellowship, I've really valued being connected to other people who share my commitments to peace and are all over the world. So we're working in NGOs, government agencies, etc. So this was the process it took to get to the fellowship, but I'm not going to go through it all because I don't think it's that interesting for you necessarily. So when I got to Australia, I had my host club. This was the Bribie Island Rotary Club, and they were really lovely. So I got to spend a lot of time with my host club. I also got to mentor some students who were doing Model UN and just happened to be representing the US. So that was kind of fun. And that's something that I really have valued about this fellowship is connecting with the Rotary network specifically, and feeling like I am a part of something much bigger than myself, and feeling at home. So in addition to being in Australia and having someone pick me up at the airport and immediately introduce me to Australia, in other places I've also been able to connect with the network which I think you probably have as well. So this was the University of Queensland, Australia. That was my cohort. Brisbane is beautiful. It was a really lovely place to live, and it was a really wonderful place to study because I got to study with people from around the world. My cohort included a human rights lawyer from the Philippines and someone who was a peace educator in Uganda, and a mediator from Kenya who worked in rural communities, and someone from Japan who worked in humanitarian response in Sudan. It was a really great group of people to learn from and with, so that was really a value. And because we overlapped with the class both above and below us, I ended up getting to meet 29 other fellows who were from all over the world, and I made this little map to kind of show some of the places that they were from. And I really do think that's one of the values of the program, is getting to learn about what peace and conflict are from a lot of different perspectives. So I focused my studies in 3 areas: peace building and development, gender and social justice, and international law, policy, and governance. And that was really because I am most passionate about peace building and development, with especially a focus on gender and social justice. But I also knew I wanted to fill in some of the gaps in terms of my understanding of systems and policy. So these were some of the courses I took. But one of the real highlights was I got to do an applied field experience where I went to UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, Arab states in Jordan. So I spent 4 months living in Amman and also spending time in some of the other countries in the region. I went to Lebanon, spoke at a conference in Qatar, helped work on a conference in Tunisia, and some other places as well. And it was just a really incredible way to understand the UN system differently, and also just to be in a new part of the world. So I was here in Amman, Jordan, but the United Nations Development Program's regional hub works with 19 countries, so all of these kind of turquoise countries. And so I really loved getting to learn about how peace building, and development intersect by being in this context. And I worked on issues related to peace, to youth. I sort of skipped something. I worked on youth leadership. I worked on some more innovation related projects. I worked on opening up space for women in civil society. So some different issues, and it was very, very impactful for me to get to be a part of that environment. And then, as I mentioned, it was really wonderful to then enter the Rotary Peace Fellowship alumni community. We are a global network of over 1,000 people now, and it's all thanks to clubs and districts like yours. All of us had to be selected and put forward through a process of Rotary clubs supporting us. And for me, it really has been special to know that there are people all over the world who I share values with, some shared experiences. And I've gotten to meet up with some of these people while traveling even. Last year at this time, I was in Ukraine, and I met up with a Rotary Peace Fellow from India who was working at UN Women in Ukraine. And these kinds of connections unfold in unexpected ways, and I just really have valued that a lot. So what have I done since? So I returned to the US in August of last year. And then in November, I started a new job at Oxfam America. So Oxfam is an international NGO, and it so happens that the American affiliate of it is based in Boston. So I moved back to Boston, where I had been living before. And Oxfam had always been kind of on my radar as an organization I'd like to work for, because they really are driven by a comprehensive vision of social justice, and thinking about power dynamics and how that plays out. But what they're kind of known for is they work on anti-poverty, and specifically around inequalities and how inequalities lead to poverty. So basically, it's not, poverty isn't just about a lack of money. It's the fact that that money is being distributed unequally. So I've been working on 2 teams, and I promise I will switch to positive peace very soon. This is the last slide about me specifically. So the first team that I joined was the US Domestic Programs team. So in November, I started working on our programs here in the United States, and we worked in Mississippi, Puerto Rico, Louisiana, Washington, DC, all over the country, working on issues like labor rights, working with poultry factory workers, for example, working on humanitarian response in Puerto Rico and in Louisiana and Mississippi in relation to hurricanes, supporting living wage research and efforts. So all of these, to me, are definitely part of positive peace, peace building. So I will get to that soon. I see a chat, so I want to be conscientious of what that is. And then the second part is that in March, I was brought on to work on the global coronavirus influencing efforts. So I know you're all very familiar with the coronavirus. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, where they were looking for somebody to step in at the global level to coordinate the advocacy and campaigns team who are going to be working on our global coronavirus response. So since March, I've gotten to work with people all over the world again, which is really exciting for me. Working with people in Tunisia, in India, in the Philippines, in Kenya, all over the world. And what we're doing is trying to guide conversations to ensure that the world's poorest do have access to things like vaccines and food, and that this is a moment for transformation and not just reestablishing the same dynamics of poverty and power that had existed before. So that's perhaps a different conversation. I can see that I'm getting a chat or seeing a chat. Please enter your questions. Oh, yes, please enter questions. Feel free to enter questions. So, okay, that was a lot of content on me. So I'm going to stop talking about me now and transition. So we looked at this before. This is the positive peace, the list of positive we're working at Oxfam to try and ensure that vaccines are accessible and not, and that the intellectual property is open. So that's one area, the free flow of information. So ensuring that people have easy access to the right information about health when we're working all over the world, ensuring that people know about sanitation and water and all of this. Good relations with neighbors and acceptance of the rights of others are things that I've worked on, especially historically when I was working in museums, working on dialogue projects, using arts for social change. So you're starting to see there are some connections here. But the Institute for Economics and Peace, so they designed a program called the Positive Peace Activators program, really because they were realizing that Rotary clubs are already very well situated. They're already working on those 8 areas in different ways, but perhaps it would be useful to actually use the language of positive peace. So in January, I was brought out to California along with, I think there were 20 other people from around North America. It was Canada and also the US. And we didn't have anyone from Mexico, but I think that there's a goal that there will be. And we were all trained in this information. And since then, we have been tasked with trying to find ways to support Rotary clubs and using it. So what is that information? So we already talked about what is the difference between negative peace and positive peace. And I mentioned that the Institute for Economics and Peace every year makes two different analyses, two indexes. So the negative peace index is called their Global Peace Index, and it measures global peacefulness in terms of negative peace. And this year, so negative peace, as we said, is the absence of violence or the fear of violence, and it's used as a definition of peace to create the Global Peace Index. So, and I should note that, yes, this is the world's leading measurement tool on peace. So everyone around the world that I've encountered who works on peace and conflict is familiar with this methodology. Institute for Economics and Peace is really the only think tank that is thinking about peace, not just violence. So it is really special. So what they do is they do research on the world using 23 different indicators, and they're measuring things like, I have the list, so I'm actually going to try and be specific. They're measuring things like the number of deaths from external organized conflict, the number of deaths from internal organized conflict, the number, duration, and role of external conflicts. I'm going to skip a little bit. Relations with neighboring countries, number of refugees and displaced people, political instability, political terror, homicide. So they're measuring things that are negative peace related. So this was last year's map. So once they measured all of the countries, they came up with this map. Green is good and red is bad, and orange is in the middle. So you'll see the United States last year was in a fairly low-ish spot, like a middle to low spot. This is this year's. We've gotten worse. Actually, no, we're about the same. But we're basically not in a great spot when it all comes down to it. If you look at the globe, the U.S. is actually about halfway down the list. So here's the list of all of the countries. We're number 121. And our negative peace, when they did this analysis, showed that we hadn't really improved very much in the United States. So the countries that were at the top were Iceland, New Zealand, Portugal, Austria, Denmark, Canada. The ones at the bottom, Afghanistan has been in the bottom slot for a few years. Syria, Iraq, etc. I'm seeing more chats. Oh yeah, yes, I see Anne Frisch, the note about her. I'll have to follow up on that. But yes, definitely. So it is worth, I do recommend looking at this list in detail if you're curious. But some of the key things to note is that over the last 12 years, so since they started doing these analyses, things haven't really been getting much better. So 79 countries have become more peaceful, 81 became less. Overall peace has declined over the decade. So even if from year to year, occasionally we have little upticks, peace has definitely declined. I will be curious to see how all of this changes now with coronavirus and with movements for racial justice. But this information is all still a little bit old. And so, as I mentioned, overall, it has, there are moments where it's gotten better, but really it's overall deteriorating. And one of the things that's especially scary is that the difference between the least peaceful and most peaceful countries is only growing. So countries that are least peaceful keep getting even less peaceful. And most peaceful countries may be improving, but it's not even at that strong of rates. So it's important to note that distinction and that gap because it's also showing that that those differences are really severe on our planet, and we need to think about our relationships with each other. So what does this actually mean economically? So one of the things that they also measure is how does this impact economics? How does this relate to the environment? So economically, the global economic impact of violence is pretty intense. $14.1 trillion were spent on violence in the last year, which is equivalent to 11.2% of the world's GDP. And that's kind of hard to imagine, but that's also $1,853 per person. So that's a lot of money that we're spending on violence. They get that money, that statistic, in part by looking at military spending, which is one of the aspects that they use in their measurements. And if we think about how that money could be used differently to support peace instead of violence, there's a lot of opportunity there. If the world decreased violence by 10%, we'd have $1.48 trillion more dollars to give to other economic activities. So these are some important and interesting statistics. And as I mentioned also, the cost financially is especially severe in countries like Afghanistan, Syria, that are experiencing high conflict. And you can see how issues are connected. It's not just that there is violence and war, there are economic impacts that make it harder and harder to move towards positive peace. So the breakdown of economic impact, I won't go into this so much in detail, but as I mentioned, military expenditure accounts for over 40% of the total economic impact of violence. And then you can see some of the ways in which they do measure that economic impact. A 1% reduction in the cost of violence is the equivalent of all of aid, the total global official development assistance in 2017. And so if we could reduce it, we would be able to actually have so much more money for things like foreign direct investment, supporting economic development. So there's a real economic need to invest in supporting peace building. So now let's shift to positive peace. So that was the negative peace side, and that is something that they call the Global Peace Index, which I can share a link to later. You can also look online. They have a very long report. It's like 100 pages long, and I certainly invite you to read it if you're interested. But they don't just want to stop with negative peace. So they also do a positive peace index. So as we discussed before, positive peace is defined as the attitudes, institutions, and structures that, when strengthened, lead to a more peaceful society. So it's supposed to be the ideal environment for human potential to flourish. And in addition to it being associated with stronger peace, it's associated with macroeconomic performance and the different factors that sustain societies, provide a framework for robust economic development. So money isn't what it's all about, but we have lots of research through IEP to show that positive peace also supports economic stability, as well as many other factors. So this is just a snapshot, an example of part of the positive peace index. I realize I didn't actually capture the whole globe this time, and I actually didn't do as much for my slideshow on this, but I'd be happy to share more. What I was hoping is that perhaps we can actually think a little bit, if we do have time, I'd be curious to think about how within Rotary, we could use this positive peace framework, recognizing that all of these issues are required for supporting positive peace. How does this connect to the work that clubs are doing? So you can see, for example, in this map, I think this was Rotary that actually put this together, how these different 8 areas overlap. So we've got, I'm looking to the right in the circle, we've got disease prevention and treatment, economic and community development, maternal and child health, peace and conflict prevention and solutions, water and sanitation, basic education and literacy. So these things all overlap with these issues. So, and I should also note that when a country and a community are more positively peaceful, they are able to bounce back and not experience so many shocks. So basically, if something goes badly in a community like coronavirus, if the society already was more peaceful, it is more likely that it will be able to bounce back. But okay, so these were the questions that I thought that I might offer up to all of you. So how can the 8 pillars of positive peace enhance our work and impact in the areas of service and areas of focus? And in what ways does your project, program, activity, if at all, promote one or more of these pillars? So this is a question that I will offer to the group, and certainly we can discuss now or in another context. I suppose I don't know what the best format is, but certainly we could open it up from here. I see some chat, so maybe what I'll do is I'll see what kinds of questions are coming up, and maybe we have a conversation, or I can answer questions as well. I know I've kind of jumped around a little bit, so okay, I'm gonna open up the chat. I've been avoiding looking at it because I was gonna get distracted. Okay, so I see Craig mentioned Anne Frisch. Wondering if there's a method or process where Anne and Raina might develop a joint structure and content to enable the district to become more involved in positive peace. Yeah, so I haven't seen if Anne is on here, but I do know Anne, and I know she works on issues of nuclear proliferation. And I definitely could see there being some connections there. So I think it's a great suggestion. Are you familiar with the business plan for peace? Oh, I've heard of that one. I don't know very much about it, but Nina, if you're on, I would welcome if you'd like to share anything about it. I would certainly be curious. And thank you, Kathy, for adding the link to the Positive Peace Index as well. So yeah, so I guess I'll turn it over. Do people have thoughts on how this might connect to their work? Or questions that you might like to bring up that we can discuss together? And I'll keep the screen on, but let me know if you want me to stop sharing. I'm happy to do that as well.
Seems all we're getting is crickets.
Lots of crickets.
Raina,
So
on the district, or on the Rotary International website, in conjunction with the IEP, there are there's about a half-hour presentation with the script all set to go about positive peace that clubs could take out, and I would love to see is the district, try to organize and get some speakers to go out to speak on this subject and get a little bit more in depth on it to further, because it's kind of a new concept to everybody.
yeah, actually, Ed, I'd love if you're willing. When we spoke, you shared some of the work that you've been doing to think about positive peace and how it connects. Perhaps you can share a little bit about the links that you're seeing.
Yeah, sure. The well, the one thing we have going now is which has come up out of the George Floyd killing. It just kind of happened organically. One club reached out to another one in St. Paul. What can we do about helping with the violence that's happening in that? And it got to short-term and long-term goals. And the longer-term goal was, how can we work long-term to really address the issue of racism? And then Rotary International came out with that statement. We don't tolerate it. And so we've had a group getting together with 30 to 40 people each week discussing how racism impacts all of us, and just starting to feel our way through some definitions and terminology, because it's not an easy conversation, and it's a lot of being open, being detached, being willing to hear what's being said and accept it, and which I'm sure is what you found a lot with the peace work, is when you're on one side or the other, it's really kind of opening that up. One of the other tools we've had in the district is Braver Angels, which works towards learning skills to be able to reach across divides, political or, whatever. And so those are some tools that we're getting out into the district, and hopefully moving all of us in a positive way towards more justice and social justice and peace.
I have a couple of questions for you, Raina. One of them was actually shown in the chat room, and it was, what was the title of your thesis
Oh,
that you
was it?
submitted for your master's degree in Brisbane at the University of Queensland?
Yeah, so I wrote, I should be able to remember the exact title, but I'm trying to remember the exact title, but I wrote about gender quotas. So gender quotas are basically having a certain number of spots reserved for women in positions of governance. So I was looking at why gender quotas were being held up as something that people wanted to invest in the transitional constitutions of Tunisia and Egypt in the wake of the Arab Spring. So I was really focused on the Arab Spring as a moment of transformation, but looking at how women's movements were fighting for gender quotas and why, looking at why in the new government structures, that was something they tried to put in place, and also asking whether those gender quotas really did lead to gender justice. So that's not an answer because I don't remember my title, but that was what I was writing about. And I'm happy to talk about it with anybody who's interested. But also thank you, Ed, for sharing a little bit about the work that you all are doing. I must say that I'm so happy to hear that it's something that you all are thinking about and investing time in. Braver Angels is a really great organization I've come in contact with through some of my dialogue work. And I think one of the things that I've certainly reflected on doing peace and conflict studies is that this work can happen at every level. It has to happen at every level. And from an academic perspective, I think sometimes, and I count myself in this, we're a little more comfortable talking about the macro level, talking about countries, for example, and thinking about peace and conflict in terms of things like war or in terms of laws, all of which are really important to consider. But also individuals are a part of this too. And so one of the things that positive peace adds to this, for me at least, is thinking about things like accepting the rights of others, accepting the rights of people who aren't like us. It seems so basic. That's basically just empathy, but actually it's not a given, and it's something that requires all of us to really challenge ourselves to think, who do we consider to be like us? Who are we othering? And to what effect? Who is that leaving out? And also thinking about, I'm literally looking at the 8 pillars again, things like good relations with neighbors. That's about safety, but it's also about respect. And it's about thinking about what a diverse community looks like, where we have a lot of different perspectives and experiences that are working together to be more and better and more inclusive. Equitable distribution of resources. So equitable meaning that everybody isn't starting from the same place, because we have histories that we're stepping in with. So ensuring that people have equitable access to resources, not just equal. So certainly hearing about the fact that, for example, you're thinking about what the death of George Floyd and the impacts of racial injustice in our country mean for our own communities and Rotary clubs. I'm really heartened to hear that, because I think it's so important. And for whatever it's worth, like I'm doing that work too. At Oxfam, we're doing that work where we're thinking internally about how we can become more racially just. And I'm personally doing a lot of reflecting and journaling and reading. And I think it's important for us all to be doing a lot of layers. But so thank you for sharing some of that, Ed. And certainly if anyone's interested, I'd love to share resources. A lot of this is coming in part because I'm a white woman. I'm white, and I know that for me, one of the ways in which I need to do a lot of work is thinking about racial justice. But I'm seeing some things in the chat, so I'm going to go back to that. Let's see. There is now a 7th area of focus on environmental. Yes, that's true. So actually, interestingly, when I was at the training in January in California, they had sort of hinted to us that this was coming. which is really exciting because it's important to be thinking about, or are you talking about in Rotary, Craig, or are you talking about with IEP? Sorry, I'm.
This is a Rotary 7th area of focus. It's brand new
Oh,
since the start of the year.
awesome. Oh, I'm so happy to hear that. And that's also interesting because what I interpreted that to be about Institute for Economics and Peace, because they also just added an environmental area, but that's great. I'm really happy to hear that.
And it's
Yeah,
it's an easy one, I think, to foster at the individual club level, because at almost every club level, you could be reducing carbon emissions. You could be doing a variety of very incrementally small things, but they are adding up.
yeah, that's great. Yeah. Oh, I'm really happy to hear that.
I did have one other question I will bring in, and you sort of touched around it. You mentioned during your presentation of yourself that your historical and background is Ashkenazi Jewish. And obviously I met your dad and I know your dad fairly well. But you also did 4 months in Amman, Jordan, which is, generally speaking, our impression would be it's absolutely the most non-Jewish environment you can imagine. It's Muslim. It's not a how do you say this, a positive environment in our perception for someone of the Jewish faith. How did you cope with that? How did you live with that? How did you deal with that?
This is a complex question, because I think one of the reasons that people imagine that there's a tension is that people often equate being Jewish with being Israeli, and Israel and Jewish, but those are different things. So I would say that certainly I did experience in Jordan a lot of complex experiences with the state of Israel. But as a person who's Jewish, when I did share that information with people, which, to be honest, I was careful about when I chose to share. But when I did, people were very embracing. But yeah, I mean, our identities do play a role in issues of safety and our relationships with others. And I would say that also for me, it was a really great experience to be in a Muslim country. I had spent time in Muslim countries before, like Morocco, but it was nice to spend like 4 months in Jordan. And as always, it's really healthy to just be outside of your comfort zone, I guess you could say, and recognize that there are so many ways to be Muslim, for example, so many ways. And every country in the region interprets what it means to be a Muslim country differently. So Tunisia, for example, is a Muslim country, and they have had access to abortion since the 60s. So there is a lot of range in what it means to apply a religion in a relation to a state context. And of course, everywhere people are different and distinct, and I met like so many different kinds of people in Jordan. So I would say that one of the things I got out of it was just like really making my own experience of the world more complex, and a reminder that you can't flatten any place. So yeah, for me, it was a really powerful experience and a really important experience to really learn and to sit in that kind of absorbing experience. But it's a good question.
Raina,
Yeah, and I see some, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Don Kelly's asking, I'll help you out with this. How does
Thank you.
healthcare fit into the 8 pillars?
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to say, I see some questions, so I apologize. So yeah, so healthcare, that's a really important one. So I think that one can fit in a few ways. One is equitable distribution of resources. So who has access to healthcare? And I think that's probably where it mostly would be, but also well-functioning governments, like does healthcare fit under there? But I think it's a really good question of like where it belongs, depending on where the work is as well. It could be a free flow of information if it's about information of healthcare. But I will have to look at the framework to know if there are other places that they list it, but I'm reasonably certain that they would put it under equitable distribution of resources and well-functioning governments. But it's a really good question. And what is this? It says, our healthcare fit into 8 pillars. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, and Don continues in, since you brought up the equitable distribution of resources. It says, but our current global population and its growth suggests that Earth's resources are not enough.
Mm.
Kind of,
So yeah, so I think this is one where we'd want to do some research, because if I read something recently, and I know this is not a helpful stat because I'm not going to back it up perfectly, but I did read something recently that we actually do have all the resources we need currently. It's just that it's distributed wrong. But I think that this is one where we'd need to do some further research. I know that issues of population are a challenge for our globe, but to me, the bigger issue is how our resources distributed, like water and money,
yeah.
because that is what controls who is able to live and die. And certainly, but that's certainly something I'd be happy to do some further research on and would love to follow up on.
And
And then
then
I see, oh
Dave
yeah, go
Newman,
ahead.
who's been part of our Fast for Hope initiative here, where we have been working in Nicaragua for, I think, about 11 years. It came off of Jeffrey Sachs' work with the Earth Institute and lifting a community up and out of, or country up and out of poverty.
Mm-hmm.
And we've really been working to build the capacity of individuals in poor communities in Nicaragua, and which is certainly fitting in with what you were saying a little bit earlier.
Yeah, that's great. And incidentally, Jeff Sachs uses these models as well in his work. So it's not an accident, probably, that those
It
overlap.
would fit right into the
The Sustainable Development Goals, yeah, the
goals,
SDGs.
SDG.
Yeah.
And then Nina Potter is asking, how important is the role of government in reparations to indigenous and enslaved peoples?
That is a great question, Nina. Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, because one of the challenges is that this is now like getting back to my master's in peace and conflict. So much of this is about sovereignty and who gets to decide and control resources within a given community or population. And so one thing that was really interesting for me personally about studying peace and conflict in Australia was that we really did talk a lot about Indigenous issues and Aboriginal ways of thinking about conflict and peace. And one of the things that would come up here, for example, is that you had the Australian government feeling that it had ownership of governance in communities of Indigenous people who would say, no, you don't, this is our land. So it does get very complex, and it's a really good question. And there is certainly, I don't know if this is what you're getting at, Nina, but sometimes the government is responsible for creating a lot of harm. And it's really important to think about not just government in a vague sense, but like, is it working well, and for whom? Who is it working for? Who is making up the government? Like, who is actually leading? Those things matter a lot. And this issue of reparations, I would really love to talk to you or anyone else about, because it's a really interesting and important question, for sure. So feel free to hop in if you wanted to add anything.
We want to be conscious
Oh,
of
okay. Yeah.
time and whatnot, but Edith James asks, why do nations of the world continue to increase budget for the military while reducing budget for social services and programs that enhances peaceful coexistence? Even poor nations of the world increase their budgets each year.
That is a great question.
I think if we crack that one, we're in the door.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, I think this is actually a really core question, because this goes to that element of balancing the macro and the micro. In the end, a lot of the change does actually have to happen at the national kind of and global level. And where are we putting our resources? And as you saw, we're putting a lot of our resources to the military. And that takes money away from things that are more sustainable. And so there are a lot of answers to this question of why. And I'm not sure that I am the best person to answer, but certainly one of the things that we talked about in my classes is that a lot of this is based on, honestly, fear. And we talked about game theory, the idea that people are afraid to basically be below the person across from them, and it creates this escalating problem where people feel that if someone else has more military, that would put them in power, so we need more military, and then it creates this kind of escalation.
And
But
Raina,
yeah,
would like to invite Cindy Carlson to unmute herself. She'd like to make a comment about some of the
please,
work they're doing in Ramsey County that
please.
fits in. So,
Yeah.
Cindy? Cindy still with us? Yeah, there she is.
Does the host need to unmute?
Oh, yeah. Am I unmuted now?
Now you are, yes.
Cindy.
Oh, okay. Okay, wonderful. Well, I wanted to mention to you that Ramsey County kicked off an endeavor this spring. They called it their Economic Competitiveness and Inclusion Plan. And it's being led by Ramsey County with the help of consultants from Fourth Economy, the Center for Economic Inclusion, NEOO Partners, and MZ Strategies. I'm not sure if you're familiar with any of those, but
No.
essentially this whole plan is an analysis of the county's economy and the work on an implementable plan that will outline economic and community objectives to pursue over the next decade. And the whole plan is framed through a lens of equity and informed by, community engagement and stakeholder buy-in. So based upon the work that I do as a banker, I was invited to participate in the work group for community building and resident wealth. Well, all of this was delayed for a period of time and just really got kicked off about a week ago. I will be participating in my first group next week. And so I find it, the timing of all of this is just so important and compelling. And I don't know if other local government groups, whether it's cities, counties, et cetera, are doing similar things, and there's takeaways to be received from others. But are you familiar with others that are doing this sort of deep dive?
So the deep dive in cities around
Yeah,
economic
around
development and
around economic competitiveness and inclusion. Really trying to get at the social justice aspect of building a more just society where there's a greater sharing of wealth.
Yeah. It's a great question, and thank you for doing that work. That's really exciting. I appreciate your sharing.
I'm looking forward to it. Yeah. And if there are others within Rotary that would be interested in being a part of any of this, well, please message me and let me know, because there's certainly room for more voices at the table.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm sure other people can respond. I'm definitely not an expert on this, but I will say that in Boston, I know they've been doing a lot of that work. And we have some really good community structures for dialogue. And certainly if I could ever be helpful, I'm happy to connect with you. But yeah, there's a lot of, it is very interesting to compare states and how they engage communities in these efforts. And maybe we'll connect offline, because
let's do.
I'm going to put my email into the chat, because I realize it's been an hour and it's 11:02. I now see, so I apologize for staying over.
and just to be cognizant of everyone's time, we'll probably bring this to a close. But we do want to thank you for coming in and sharing with what you're doing in Positive Peace. It's something that's on my radar, and I was just with one of our clubs today speaking, and I'm really talking about the concept of positive peace, and we all need to learn more about it, and would really love to see it pushed out through the district. And I am just so thrilled to hear your story and know that my Rotary Foundation dollars are being so well spent on training peace fellows like yourself. So thank you so much for what you do. And to everybody else, thank you for being part of this today, and come again, watch the emails for future Friday features.